I've asked my brother to help us start this little session because there are only a few kinds of Christian language, and all is wrapped up in confession. And there are poems and prayers, songs and narratives. Everything else is commentary. 50 years ago, a song was written that I've asked my brother to help me sing because he's actually the troubadour. But we start with a poem prayer. And we're going to go to a song. And then we're going to go to stories, narratives. From William Butler Yeats. And I picked this because this is a scholar's heart. God, guard me from those thoughts men think in mind alone. He that thinks a lasting song thinks in marrow bone. I pray, for word is out and prayer comes round again, that I may seem though I die old, a foolish, passionate man. The song and the stories that we'll share today are of the marrow bone type. We've rehearsed once. Some years ago, on a hot, dusty day, Wendell Scott joined the Mexicans to march for more pay. The old man in Abilene began to insist that Wendell Scott was a communist. How long must we wait? How long till we see that Jesus Christ died to set people free? They marched down the road on that hot, dusty day. They sang all together along the way. Back in McAllen, the word was passed down that Wendell Scott died out of town. How long must we wait? How long till we see that Jesus Christ died to set people free? The elders at Highland said that Wendell must go. If he marches with the Mexicans, we'll take back our dough. Wendell replied, no, you can't buy me. I'll march with my people so that they can be free. How long must we wait? How long till we see that Jesus Christ died to set people free? His wife said to Wendell, what will we do? We got 5 little children and a preaching school too. Wendell said, Maria, God will provide, for it was for our people that the Lord Jesus died. How long must we wait? How long till we see that Jesus Christ died to set people free? The old men in Abilene did rant and rail when they found them a soul that was not for sale. Tell this story wherever you can, for Wendell, like Jesus, was God's own man. How long must we wait? How long till we see that Jesus Christ died to set people free? That Jesus Christ died to set people free. is a dear friend of Wendell's, as many others. Poems, prayers, promises, stories. This is a sad, courageous, heroic story of faith lived not just in thought and in systems, but in deeds and actions. A story of one of our Church of Christ ministers in the 1960s that ended in his ignominious firing after he was portrayed as a communist, not as a Christian. His wife was wounded into terminal depression. And Karl Marx could be heard in the opium smoke of history saying, "I told you so." When Dwayne Evans was here today, I didn't know these people were going to be here. And Walter Birch, names some of you may know, tried to find a group of men of influence, and it was men in those days because we were a brotherhood, to sign a statement of support. Most of those they approached wouldn't sign because they couldn't risk their reputation. And those of us at the time willing to sign didn't have any reputation to waste or risk. We are, as the Church of Jesus Christ, oikomene, worldwide and universal, from every tribe and tongue and nation under earth, the vision of the apocalypse, a holy priesthood, in Latin a pontifex, the pontiff who touches as a bridge the meaning of the word, both sides of the chasm. Our Lord showed us in the incarnation the way, the living parable of priesting. His first text was, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." The result of this sermon, by the one who crossed all the boundaries and bridged it, was to be run out of town, to be killed, foreshadowing that time in which religious authority and political power joined forces to get the job done. So, I've been asked to talk about my experience as a minister in a church I love and loved between 1960 and 1975, and social justice issues. Keep in mind, a half a century has come and gone since this period. It's hard for you to believe. Bob Randolph looks like a half century. I can only testify and briefly point and tell stories. Narrative is the form all human experience takes, and it is the form that the Bible takes, and everything else in it is commentary. The research is recorded in 20 years of mission journal and countless hours of pastoral conversations, like Does God Cry With Us? Still in the heart of pastoral. In places called the Orange Street Mission in London, where A.M. Toplady once worshipped, wrote Rock of Ages. Among the homeless, the East New York Projects, Liberty House in Trenton, New Jersey, Disciples House, again in London, England, the Disciples Center for Human Wholeness in Appalachia, Seems like I've lived my entire life in the north axis of the church. The border between world and church. Witness and work is also done in a few books and journal articles written standing up and on the run. And the scholarly work, folk like Don Haynes, Harold Strawn, Richard Hughes, and many of you that are here today. My part is small, but it is witness. As a student at ACC, an urban missionary in a multinational, multicultural, multiracial, multigenerational, multilingual congregation in London, England, where people like Fausto Salvoni, funny how these, Everett Ferguson in this faculty, and others came to teach in our little preaching school too. As a student at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, a pastor of an urban church in New York, and sometime chaplain to Shiloh inner city gospel ministers of both genders. And their pastor when I preached the funeral of Phil Roseberry. After he'd been shot dead up in East New York one night, walking a child. Briefly recall the times. 50 years ago, the 1st Marines set foot in Vietnam at a special forces camp called Play Me, with a small cadre of American soldiers and 300 Vietnamese marginalized indigenous people called Montagnards set astride the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the Central Highlands and came under attack by 6,000 North Vietnamese regulars and Viet Cong soldiers. I had a special interest in this camp because my brother was there, and I had earlier received a visit in London from what I told Annette was going to be 2 Mormon missionaries. It turned out to be 2 FBI agents. Because my brother, in gaining a top security clearance, had said his brother was a Christian missionary in England. And the FBI and everyone else knows that Christianity had been in England for at least 1,500 years, so they thought he was lying. And then there was the peace movement thing. And the peace movement and the Vietnam War tore right through our nation, our family, our hearts. American economic, political, and religious imperialism was troubled. That same year, a group led by our black Christian sisters and brothers, with St. Augustine's words, "Shout hallelujah and keep on walking," ringing in their ears, marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma into what came to be known as Bloody Sunday. Freedom marches were underway, accompanied by disappearances, lynchings, church bombings of Sunday schools, civil rights and women's rights issues, issues of urban and rural grinding poverty, and riots, burn baby burn, and segregation, racism, and bigotry in our own house, including our churches and our colleges alike. Social and economic inequality and the question of systemic injustice. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the United Farm Workers, the drug revolution, the student revolution, the sexual revolution, the arms race and nuclear disarmament, institutional lying from government, from churches, and from families, abuse of children, and abuse of spouses, and abuse of life, overt and covert attempt to silence the voices of concern in our midst, and 4 high-profile assassinations. And you can write your own list in tears. Story 1. The decade of the 1960s began for me as a student at ACC. I was a preacher boy. I hated the term then, and I hate the term now, but that's what I've remained for over 50 years. And at the end of this 15-year slice of time, 60 to 75, I made a final conscious decision to stay committed to ministry in local communities of faith, where 2 or 3 are gathered, rather than taking a degree at Princeton in social ethics under Gibson Winter and Dick Shaw and going into Buchanan. In 4 years of undergraduate study at ACC, I never heard the term social ethics or social justice. In a great class at ACC with a great teacher, our beloved Dr. Malherbe, I asked a question in class. Talk about being naive and great. I asked a question in class that went something like this: that's a tremendous insight about the church in Thessalonica. Does it have anything to say about what's going on in Abilene? Answer: I'm an exegete. I don't do hermeneutics. Translated, I deal in what it meant, not in what it means. Gotthold Lessing's ugly ditch of history would not be addressed. The drive was to become first-century Christians, even though there could be no such thing 20 centuries along. Those folks are all dead. Yet the weekly meetings of mission study fired our imaginations, and we were assured we could take the world for Christ in our generation. Of course, we couldn't even take one street for Christ. But hyperbole in language never seemed to be questioned. We came from a theology and culture that seemed to believe if you declared something in the mind, you made it so in reality. And so Burton Kaufman in the 70s could stand in the Manhattan church and say, is there anybody here that really believes there's racism in the Church of Christ? It was some gathering that like Bob Randolph would get together in Boston. There were a bunch of us there. 2 people stood up. We came from a theology and culture that seemed to believe if you decided something, declared it in the mind, it made it so in reality. And the fundamental thing that we'll talk about, Richard, tomorrow morning in response to your paper, is that we foolishly believed in this boatload of biblical scholars we've produced. We foolishly believed if we became masters of the text, we would automatically become servants of the word. And that's the biggest lie we swallowed. If we became masters of the text, we would automatically become servants of the word. And from pulpits across the nation, we gave thanks that we were not like other people. Story 2. 1964, my wife and I were getting ready to leave for London. Began our ministry with the Wembley Church of Christ. In 1961, I had been in a campaign for Christ led by Batsell Barrett Baxter and Otis Gatewood under the direction of the Hillsborough Church of Christ in Nashville. We had spent a Sunday afternoon with the elders of this church. The elder who had prayed earnestly for the lost souls of London 30 minutes earlier was now driving us back to our motel to send us to the mission field. As we passed a young boy of no more than 7 or 8 playing in some sand at the curb's edge, he turned to his wife and said, "Look, first ministry in the Church of Christ was underway. My youthful excitement congealing into a heavy heart. Story 3. A few years later, I was driving George Benson. I'm an equal opportunity offender. I get all the colleges in. I was driving George Benson around the newly constructed Wembley Church building, showing him the council housings which we would call projects that were being built all around the church. I was quite excited. Brother Benson shook his head and said, "What a shame. You cannot build strong churches with poor people." Story 4. I ended up at Union Seminary to study urban ministry with Bill Weber and the folk of the East Harlem Protestant Parish, and to focus on Union's program in religion and psychiatry, figuring I would need to support myself as a psychotherapist if I were to be able to continue ministry in some form. I had friends that kept getting fired. My brother told me when I went to Union, I had eliminated 90% of my future employers in the Churches of Christ. And then when I became editor of Mission Journal, first full-time editor of Mission Journal, he sent me a telegram and said, "You've now managed to eliminate the other 10%. He was always a man of encouragement. That's why I call him Barnabas. I ended up then studying liberation theology, studying under the friendship and tutoralship of Ruben Alves, beautiful Latin American liberation theologian, activist, poet, and philosopher. Story 4. My years with Mission Journal were both exhilarating and painful. I never applied for the job and turned down the first interview. When I finally went for the interview and was called to this ministry, I decided I had been on the run from my call, and that I was in the belly of a whale. And then I got puked up in the editorial offices of Mission in Nineveh, Texas. My editorials were called "What and So What?", pointing to a commitment to theological reflection and practical application of the visions of Jesus' mission and call to mission. In other words, to helping the church we all love to move beyond being just personal groupies of a personal Savior or a book club, even if the Bible was a book. We wanted to explore the gospel as a message and means of living transformation, more than a pattern to lead to the restoration of an organization of the first century. Church as community more than institution. The Bible as a living word more than a dead letter, and a guiding light to the future more than a hitching post to the past, or a place to hide from present challenges. To lift up grace and gracious living over legalism and works righteousness, justice concerns of Jesus more than right ideas about the Bible. We wanted to explore Christian faith in the public square and the mission of God in the world, not reformation nor restoration, but transformation. During those years, Mission made a lot of people mad, made a lot of people extremely happy, a lot of people think, a lot of people laugh, and a lot of people go on the attack. It was an effort in open Christian journalism, theological reflection, a wider ecumenical outlook, and less sectarian spirit, a focus on the gospel paradigm being death and resurrection rather than preservation and maintenance of the status quo. I personally think Mission was neither as good as some people thought nor as bad as some people figured. We published a particularly telling article at the beginning of the 70s on the silence of the scholars, and offended some of our dearest friends. Yet they were forced to choose between their jobs as teachers in our colleges and board members of the journal. Yet they could freely associate with their sisters and brothers in their professional and scholarly guilds, drawn from many religious or denominational traditions, or no religion at all, but not with Mission Journal. In addition, since I was editor of Mission, my wife and I and our children were declared persona non grata in many churches of Christ. In others, we were told by elderships that we could attend church and give our money, but we couldn't preach, teach, pray, lead, or serve in any way publicly. We called it the policy of open wallets and shut mouths. Let me point briefly to some troubling disconnects that I think we have learned from over these last 50 years in this bridge building priesthood that we're part of. There was definitely a disconnect between textual study of the Bible and theological reflection. There was a disconnect between the what of Jesus and his message and the so what of the difference it makes to our lives in the world. There was definitely a disconnect between exegesis and hermeneutics. There was a disconnect between the church and the real object of God's love, God's Word. There was a disconnect between biblical faith and social justice. A disconnect between the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. Between xenophobia, the fear of strangers, and the practice of Christian hospitality, what Paul called in Romans philoxenia, the love of strangers. And then the stranger is shut out from our communities and the table of the Lord, who ate with everyone, is closed. It is not Christian hospitality or practice if the stranger is not present. There was a disconnect between personal piety and public witness, between the gospel paradigm of death and resurrection and the institutional cultural paradigm of preservation and maintenance of the status quo, between the idea of the restoration principle as an ideological methodology and human transformation as a dynamic principle of Christian faith, between the concept of faith as certitude connected to being right and faith as risk connected to Jesus' invitation to risk it all for life and the love of God. There was a disconnect between what we love to call law and order and law and justice. I close with two insights. One from John Chrysostom, the great preacher of Constantinople, and one from my son, Lance, when he was in EMT on the London Ambulance Service. Chrysostom said, if you can't find Jesus in the beggar at the door of the church, you won't find Jesus in the chalice at the altar. The point is that Jesus actually told us in all of our biblical studies where he would be. In the Eucharist and in the poor and the least of these. My son Lance was called to a plush velvet pew church in London. The vicar was concerned about a tramp in one of the pews. He didn't look right, and he didn't smell right. Lance and his colleague examined him medically, asked him a few questions. They then turned to leave. The vicar of Christ, in great agitation, rushed up to them and said, aren't you going to remove him and take him with you? Lance said, no, he is not sick. He does not need a hospital. He is tired and hungry and lonely and homeless. He needs a church. May God have mercy.
Well, the one thing I can tell you is that I had the opportunity to read these first, so I knew what I was getting into. How to respond. I'm called to respond. What an absurd notion. It's really a false question. What I'd really like to do is pause for a moment and offer prayer for Victor, for Harold's cancer. Let us pray. We are grateful, dear Lord, for our brothers, Victor and Harold, who have chosen to share their stories with us. May we be prodded by their honesty and inspired by their experiences to live our lives as faithfully as they have lived theirs. Amen. Telling stories is the order of today, so let me tell a few of my own. When I graduated from Abilene Christian College, I went to work for the school. It seemed wise to stay fairly close in those difficult days. I was recruiting students, and that meant traveling across the states in the Southwest, and I had a chance to touch base with people who had known my family, and particularly my grandfather, E.W. Macmillan, a former head of the Bible department, the minister of the college church when it was located on the south side of town. The years were the 1960s, as you know, 1963, 62, 63. There was unrest in Mississippi at that point. And I remember that some of us spent an evening on the phone trying to raise a former student who was there so he could tell us what was really happening at Ole Miss. We were also aware of what should have been happening here, but was not. My career working for Abilene Christian was cut short by the need to return to graduate school. Vietnam, of course, was in the picture. And I was on my way. Before I did, I learned that ACC had decided to integrate the next year. And I thought it was time to go and tell Mrs. Carpenter at Terrell